The cardiac arrest happened so fast that even the doctors were caught off guard. As the code blue team rushed in, the old orderly in the corner was supposed to step aside and let the professionals work. Instead, he stepped forward, his hands moving with a precision that shocked everyone in the room. Because while they had studied trauma medicine in textbooks, he had learned it in foxholes. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of hidden heroism and life-saving instincts, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like ordinary heroes deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who save lives in silence. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when everything changed at St. Mary's General Hospital. Room 314 had been quiet all afternoon, an elderly patient recovering from routine surgery, his family visiting, the atmosphere calm and peaceful. Thomas Martinez was doing what he always did, emptying waste baskets, checking supply levels, staying invisible while the important people did important work. At 68 years old, Thomas had been pushing gurneys and mopping floors at St. Mary's for 15 years. He was the kind of employee administrators loved, reliable, quiet, never called in sick, never caused problems. He worked double shifts when needed, covered holidays, and asked for nothing in return except a steady paycheck and the chance to remain unnoticed. The medical staff barely acknowledged him. To Dr. Sarah Collins, the chief of emergency medicine, he was just part of the furniture. To the nurses, he was the guy who restocked their supply closets. To the residents, he was invisible, someone who cleaned up after their mistakes but never offered opinions or got in their way. What none of them knew was that Thomas Martinez had once been Staff Sergeant Thomas Martinez, 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Medical Battalion. What they didn't know was that his gentle hands had performed battlefield surgery under enemy fire in Vietnam, treating wounds that would have killed patients before they reached any hospital. What they didn't know was that the combat medical badge in his jacket pocket represented more trauma experience than most of them would see in their entire careers. Then Mr. Henderson in bed 2 started to code. It began with a simple complaint: chest pain, nothing unusual for a 75-year-old man 3 days post-op. The monitors started beeping irregularly, then faster, then in that urgent pattern that makes every medical professional drop what they're doing and run. Within seconds, Mr. Henderson was unconscious, his heart rhythm chaotic, his family screaming for help. Dr. Collins arrived first, followed by 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist. Standard protocol, standard team, standard equipment. But Mr. Henderson wasn't responding to standard treatment. His blood pressure was crashing, his oxygen levels plummeting, and the defibrillator wasn't getting a response. Thomas watched from the corner where he'd been changing the wastebasket liner. He saw the panic in Dr. Collins' eyes, the hesitation in the nurse's movements, the way the respiratory therapist's hands shook as she tried to establish an airway. He recognized the signs, not of medical incompetence, but of trauma beyond their experience. Because Thomas had seen this exact scenario dozens of times before, in places where there were no monitors, no crash carts, no backup teams. He'd seen it in rice paddies and jungle clearings, in the back of helicopters and in bomb craters that served as impromptu operating rooms. He'd seen young soldiers with hearts that stopped beating, and he'd learned how to make them beat again. That's when his 2 worlds collided. "Doctor," Thomas said quietly, stepping forward. "His jugular veins are distended. Look at his chest rise." Dr. Collins barely glanced at him. "Not now, we need to focus dash." "Tension pneumothorax," Thomas continued, his voice steady but urgent. "His lung has collapsed and it's compressing his heart. The defibrillator won't work until you decompress his chest." Something in his tone made everyone freeze. This wasn't the voice of an orderly making suggestions. This was the voice of someone who had seen death up close and knew how to fight it. Dr. Collins stared at him for a split second that felt like an eternity. Mr. Henderson's monitor was flatlining, his wife was crying, and every second of hesitation brought them closer to losing him. She had 2 choices: follow protocol and call for a thoracic surgeon who might not arrive in time, or trust the hospital orderly who was speaking with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "What do you need?" she asked. Thomas moved with the efficiency of muscle memory that had been dormant for decades but never forgotten. Large bore needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. Dr. Collins handed him the needle with shaking hands. Thomas felt for the landmark with his fingertips, the same technique he'd used in the field when there was no time for x-rays or careful preparation. He inserted the needle with one smooth motion, and immediately there was a rush of air as the trapped pressure released. Mr. Henderson's heart rhythm returned instantly. His blood pressure stabilized. His oxygen levels began climbing. Within 30 seconds, he was breathing on his own again, conscious and asking what had happened. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors showing normal rhythms. Dr. Collins stared at Thomas with a mixture of awe and confusion. The nurses exchanged glances that said they'd just witnessed something extraordinary but couldn't quite process what it meant. "How did you?" Dr. Collins began, then stopped. Because the answer was obvious in the way Thomas had moved, the confidence in his hands, the clinical detachment that only came from performing life-saving procedures under the worst possible conditions. Thomas stepped back, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was focused on him. For 15 years, he'd been invisible, and now he was the center of attention in a way that made his chest tight with old anxiety. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, revealed skills that raised questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "I should get back to work," he said quietly, turning toward his cart. That's when it happened. As he reached for his cleaning supplies, the movement caused his jacket to shift, and something small and metallic fell from his pocket. It hit the linoleum floor with a soft clink that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Dr. Collins bent down and picked it up before Thomas could react. It was a military badge, tarnished with age but unmistakable to anyone who understood military insignia. A caduceus surrounded by a wreath, with wings at the top and a scroll at the bottom bearing the words Expert Field Medical Badge. But this wasn't just any medical badge. This was the Combat Medical Badge, awarded only to medical personnel who had provided medical care while under enemy fire. The kind of badge that represented not just medical training, but medical training tested in the crucible of combat. Dr. Collins looked from the badge to Thomas, her understanding dawning like sunrise. "You're not just an orderly, are you?" Thomas stood motionless, his carefully constructed anonymity crumbling around him. After 15 years of hiding in plain sight, his two lives had collided in the worst possible way. The peaceful, invisible existence he'd built was about to be shattered by a small piece of metal that represented the most intense period of his life. "I was," he said simply. "A long time ago." But Dr. Collins wasn't finished. She was a trauma surgeon, trained to read details that others missed, and now she was looking at Thomas with new eyes. The way he'd moved during the emergency, the precision of his technique, the calm authority in his voice, none of that came from watching medical procedures from the sidelines. "Where?" she asked. "Where did you serve?" Thomas met her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Because the answer to that question would open doors he'd spent decades keeping locked, would drag him back to memories he'd worked so hard to bury, would force him to relive the 6 months that had defined and nearly destroyed him. "Vietnam," Thomas said quietly. 1970 to 1971. 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Medical Battalion. The words hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Dr. Collins had read about Vietnam in medical journals, studied the advances in trauma care that had emerged from that conflict, but she'd never stood face to face with someone who had lived it. "How many?" she asked, and Thomas knew she wasn't asking about his length of service. "I stopped counting after 50, he replied, his voice steady but distant. "In 6 months, I stopped counting." To understand how Thomas Martinez had ended up pushing a mop cart at St. Mary's Hospital, you need to understand what happened to a 19-year-old kid from East LA who thought he was going to Vietnam to fix radios and ended up becoming one of the most effective combat medics in the 1st Cavalry Division. Thomas had enlisted in 1969, not out of patriotism or family tradition, but because his neighborhood offered few alternatives to young men with brown skin and broken English. The Army promised training, discipline, and a way out of the projects where bullets flew for different reasons but killed just as dead. He'd scored high on the medical aptitude tests, high enough to qualify for advanced training as a field medic. The instructors at Fort Sam Houston taught him to treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and traumatic amputations. They taught him to work under pressure, to make life-and-death decisions in seconds, to carry wounded soldiers to safety while under fire. What they couldn't teach him was what it felt like to hold a dying 18-year-old in your arms while mortars exploded around you. What they couldn't prepare him for was the weight of knowing that your decisions meant the difference between someone going home to their family or going home in a box. Firebase Alpha was supposed to be a secure position, a forward observation post monitoring enemy movement along the Cambodian border. What intelligence reports hadn't mentioned was that 2 battalions of North Vietnamese Army regulars were moving through the area, and Firebase Alpha was directly in their path. The attack came at dawn on March 23, 1971. Thomas was in the aid station, updating medical supplies inventory, when the first mortar rounds hit. Within minutes, the firebase was under assault from 3 sides, with casualties streaming into his small medical bunker faster than any textbook had prepared him for. The first wounded soldier who came through the door was Private Rodriguez, 19 years old, hit in the chest by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. His lung had collapsed, he was going into shock, and the nearest surgical hospital was 40 miles away through hostile territory. By every medical protocol Thomas had learned, Rodriguez should have died. But Thomas refused to let that happen. Working with limited supplies and no backup, he performed an emergency thoracotomy using a field surgical kit, reinflated Rodriguez's lung, and stabilized him enough for evacuation. Rodriguez lived, went home to San Antonio, and raised 3 children who never knew how close they came to never being born. That was the first. Over the next 4 hours, as Firebase Alpha fought for its survival, Thomas treated 23 wounded soldiers. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, severe burns, traumatic amputations, wounds that would have challenged experienced surgeons in fully equipped hospitals. He worked with morphine running low, bandages in short supply, and enemy fire so close he could hear bullets striking the sandbags around his aid station. But the case that would haunt him for the next 50 years was Private Johnson, a machine gunner from Detroit who took a direct hit from a mortar round. Johnson was conscious when they brought him in, asking about his legs, not knowing that both had been severed below the knee. Thomas looked at wounds that were beyond his ability to treat, at a soldier who would bleed out in minutes without intervention he wasn't equipped to provide. What happened next was something Thomas had never discussed, not with the Army psychiatrists, not with the VA counselors, not with anyone. Because sometimes the hardest decision a medic makes isn't how to save a life, but how to ease a death when saving is impossible. Johnson died holding Thomas's hand, asking him to tell his mother he'd been brave. Thomas promised he would, a promise he kept 3 months later when he stood in a Detroit cemetery and watched a 20-year-old hero get buried while his mother cried questions that had no good answers. The Firebase Alpha attack lasted 14 hours. When the relief force finally arrived, they found 23 wounded soldiers alive who shouldn't have been, and 1 young medic sitting in blood-soaked fatigues, staring at hands that had worked miracles and witnessed horrors in equal measure. The citation for Thomas's Bronze Star with Valor read, "For exceptionally meritorious service and acts of heroism while serving as a medic with the 1st Cavalry Division during enemy action near the Cambodian border." Specialist Martinez repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to treat and evaluate wounded personnel, performing advanced medical procedures under extreme combat conditions and demonstrating extraordinary courage in the preservation of human life. What the citation didn't mention was the cost of that heroism. How Thomas started having nightmares about the soldiers he couldn't save. How he began to flinch at loud noises, to scan every room for exits, to feel responsible for every injury he saw. How the smell of disinfectant made him think of blood, and the sound of medical alarms made him think of dying soldiers calling for their mothers. The Army promoted him to sergeant and offered him re-enlistment with a bonus and choice of assignments. Thomas turned it down. He'd used up whatever courage he'd been born with in those 14 hours at Firebase Alpha, and he knew it. He also knew that if he stayed in the Army, they'd send him back to Vietnam, and he wasn't sure he could survive another Firebase Alpha. His discharge papers listed him as combat veteran, medical specialist, honorable service. What they should have listed was young man permanently changed by things no young man should see, carrying wounds that don't show on x-rays. Thomas returned to Los Angeles in 1971, 21 years old and feeling 50. The city had changed while he was gone, or maybe he had changed and couldn't see it the same way. The anti-war protests, the questions about Vietnam, the way people looked at veterans, it all felt like judgment for things they couldn't understand. He tried using his medical training in civilian hospitals, but every emergency reminded him of Firebase Alpha. Every trauma patient became a wounded soldier, every code blue became an enemy attack, every loss of life became another failure to carry. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat made it impossible to function in peacetime medicine. So Thomas did what many veterans do when the world doesn't understand them: he disappeared. He took jobs that didn't require explanations, construction work, factory jobs, anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions about his background. He moved frequently, never staying long enough to form attachments, never talking about his service or the skills that had made him one of the most effective combat medics in Vietnam. The decades passed in a blur of anonymous employment and careful invisibility. Thomas learned to suppress the medical instincts that had once saved lives, to watch emergencies without intervening, to let other people be heroes while he stayed safely in the background. It was a form of survival, trading purpose for peace, accepting invisibility as the price of avoiding the memories that came with being needed. When he finally applied for the orderly position at St. Mary's Hospital in 2008, he was 58 years old and tired of running. The job was perfect for someone who wanted to be around medicine without practicing it, who needed the routine of healing environments without the responsibility of making life and death decisions. For 15 years, it had worked. He came to work, did his job, went home to an empty apartment where no one asked about his past or expected him to be anyone other than Thomas Martinez, hospital orderly. He watched young doctors learn procedures he'd mastered under fire, saw nurses struggle with cases he could have handled in his sleep, observed medical emergencies with the detached interest of someone who had retired from the business of saving lives. But muscle memory doesn't retire. Training doesn't fade. And when Mr. Henderson started coding in room 314, Thomas discovered that some instincts are stronger than the need to stay hidden. Now, standing in that hospital room with his combat medical badge in Dr. Collins' hand and his carefully constructed anonymity in ruins, Thomas realized that his two worlds were about to collide in ways he wasn't prepared for. Word spread through St. Mary's Hospital like water through a broken dam. By evening, everyone from the janitors to the chief of staff knew that the quiet orderly in the basement had performed an emergency procedure that had saved a patient's life. More importantly, they knew he'd done it with the kind of expertise that only came from extensive medical training and real-world experience. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the chief of staff, called Thomas into her office the next morning. She was a no-nonsense administrator who had run St. Mary's for 12 years, and she wasn't accustomed to discovering that her employees had been hiding significant qualifications. "Mr. Martinez," she began, gesturing for him to sit across from her mahogany desk. "I think we need to have a conversation about your background." Thomas sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on a point just over her shoulder. He'd known this moment would come as soon as the combat medical badge had fallen from his pocket. There was no going back to invisibility now, no pretending he was just another hospital worker with no medical knowledge. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've never lied on any application or done anything that violated hospital policy." Dr. Hendricks pulled out his employment file, a surprisingly thin folder for someone who had worked at the hospital for 15 years. "Your application lists your previous experience as general labor and maintenance work. It doesn't mention any medical training or military service." "Because you didn't ask," Thomas replied. "The application asked about relevant work experience. I applied for an orderly position, not a medical position." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same intensity she brought to budget meetings and board presentations. "Dr. Collins tells me you performed an emergency needle decompression yesterday with the skill of someone who had done it many times before." She also tells me you diagnosed a tension pneumothorax faster and more accurately than most of our residents could have. Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't lead to more questions he didn't want to answer. The combat medical badge that fell from your pocket, Dr. Hendricks continued, represents the highest level of medical training the military provides. It's awarded to medical personnel who have provided care under combat conditions. Most of our doctors have never seen trauma like what you must have treated in Vietnam. That was a long time ago, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Skills like that don't just disappear, Dr. Hendricks replied. The question is why someone with your training and experience has been content to work as an orderly for 15 years. It was the question Thomas had been dreading, because answering it honestly would require explaining things he'd never told anyone. How do you explain that you've been hiding from your own competence? How do you tell someone that the thing you're best at is also the thing that haunts you every night? How do you describe choosing invisibility over purpose because purpose comes with a weight you're not sure you can carry anymore? Some people aren't meant to be heroes, Thomas said finally. Some people do their service and then step back and let others take over. Dr. Hendricks set down his file and leaned forward. Mr. Martinez, yesterday you saved a man's life using skills and knowledge that most of our medical staff don't possess. You did it instinctively, without hesitation, and with a level of competence that suggests extensive experience with life-threatening trauma. That's not someone stepping back from heroism, that's someone who never stopped being a hero, even when he was trying to hide it. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. For 15 years, he'd told himself that he was done with medicine, done with being responsible for other people's lives, done with making decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But yesterday, when Mr. Henderson was dying, all of that careful distance had evaporated in an instant. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked. Dr. Hendricks smiled for the first time since he'd entered her office. "I want to offer you a position in our emergency department. Training position initially, to get you current on civilian protocols and modern equipment. But your experience with trauma medicine is exactly what we need, especially during night shifts when we're understaffed and dealing with the kinds of cases that challenge even our most experienced physicians." Thomas stared at her, unable to process what she was suggesting. Return to medicine? Take responsibility for patients again? Risk failing someone the way he'd failed Private Johnson 50 years earlier? "I can't," he said, standing up abruptly. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that." "Why not?" Dr. Hendricks asked, but Thomas was already walking toward the door. "Because," he said without turning around, "some doors should stay closed." That night, Thomas sat in his small apartment, staring at the combat medical badge that had spent 15 years hidden in his jacket pocket. The tarnished metal caught the light from his kitchen lamp, casting shadows that reminded him of other times, other places, other decisions that had changed everything. His apartment was sparse by design: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a television that he rarely watched. No photographs, no mementos, no evidence of the life he'd lived before becoming Thomas Martinez, hospital orderly. It was the living space of someone who had chosen to exist rather than live, to survive rather than thrive. But now, holding the badge that represented both his greatest achievement and his deepest trauma, Thomas found himself remembering things he'd spent decades trying to forget. Private Johnson wasn't the only soldier who had died in Thomas's arms. There had been others: Sergeant Williams, who'd stepped on a landmine while on patrol; Corporal Davis, who'd taken shrapnel to the neck from a mortar round; Private First Class Chen, barely 18 years old, who'd bled out from a gunshot wound while Thomas worked frantically to save him. For every soldier Thomas had saved, there was another he'd lost. For every success story like Rodriguez, who went home to his family, there was a failure like Johnson, who went home in a box. The mathematics of combat medicine were brutal and unforgiving, and Thomas had learned early that even the best medic couldn't save everyone. But knowing that intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. Every soldier who died became a weight Thomas carried, a reminder of his limitations, a question about whether he could have done something different, something better, something that might have changed the outcome. The nightmares had started during his second month in Vietnam and never really stopped. Sometimes he dreamed about Firebase Alpha, reliving those 14 hours in vivid detail. Sometimes he dreamed about the soldiers he'd lost, their faces frozen in the moment of death, their voices asking why he hadn't been able to save them. The worst dreams were the ones where he succeeded in saving everyone, where his hands moved with impossible speed and precision, where every procedure worked perfectly and every soldier went home alive. He would wake from those dreams feeling worse than from the nightmares, because they reminded him of what he'd wanted to be and how far short he'd fallen. That's why he'd left medicine after Vietnam. Not because he wasn't good at it. Dr. Collins' reaction had proven he was still better than most, but because being good at it meant accepting responsibility for outcomes he couldn't control. It meant risking the kind of failure that destroyed you from the inside, failure measured not in statistics but in human lives. Thomas stood up and walked to his bathroom mirror, looking at the 68-year-old face that stared back at him. Gray hair, lines around his eyes, hands that showed the calluses of 15 years pushing mop carts and restocking supply cabinets. He looked like exactly what he was, an aging hospital worker with no ambitions beyond collecting his paycheck and avoiding attention. But yesterday, in room 314, those hands had moved with the precision of a combat medic. Yesterday, his mind had processed symptoms and formulated treatment plans with the speed that had once made him one of the most effective trauma specialists in the 1st Cavalry Division. Yesterday, for just a few minutes, he'd been Sergeant Thomas Martinez again instead of Thomas Martinez, orderly. The question now was whether he could live with going back to being invisible, knowing that his skills could make a difference in the emergency department. Knowing that there might be other Mr. Hendersons who would die because Thomas was too afraid to step forward. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, and Thomas almost didn't answer. He'd been avoiding calls all day, knowing that word of his background had spread and that people would have questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Hello," he said finally. "Mr. Martinez? This is Dr. Collins. I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, it's fine. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you again for what you did yesterday. Mr. Henderson is doing well. He'll be going home tomorrow morning." "That's good to hear." There was a pause, and Thomas could sense that Dr. Collins had more to say. "Mr. Martinez, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I have a question that might seem strange." "Okay. How many people do you think you saved in Vietnam?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. It was the one calculation he'd never allowed himself to make, the sum he'd refused to add up because the answer would make his current life even harder to justify. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I've been looking at your service record. It's partially classified, but I have enough clearance to see the summary. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 with Valor. A Silver Star. Combat Medical Badge with 3 clusters. 53 confirmed saves during your tour." Thomas closed his eyes. 53. 53 young men who had gone home to their families, who had lived lives and raised children and grown old because of decisions he'd made in jungle clearings and bomb craters and aid stations under fire. "Dr. Martinez," Dr. Collins continued, using his old rank, "those 53 soldiers probably had children. And grandchildren. And great-grandchildren. Your hands didn't just save 53 lives, they saved hundreds of lives that never would have existed without your intervention." Thomas sat down heavily on his couch, the weight of her words settling on him like a physical presence. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because yesterday you saved one more life," Dr. Collins replied. "And tomorrow there might be another one. And I think you need to ask yourself whether hiding from who you are is really honoring the 53 soldiers who lived because of who you were." Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, turning the combat medical badge over in his hands, thinking about Dr. Collins' words and the weight of choices that had shaped 50 years of his life. At 3 a.m., he pulled out a box from his bedroom closet, the first time he'd opened it in 15 years. Inside were the things he'd kept from Vietnam, photographs of his unit, letters from soldiers he'd treated, and a manila folder containing medical commendations and training certificates that documented his expertise in trauma medicine. There was also a letter he'd never sent, written to Private Johnson's mother but never mailed because he'd been too ashamed to sign his name to words that felt inadequate. The letter explained how her son had died bravely, how he'd asked Thomas to tell her he loved her, how his last words had been about wanting to come home. Thomas read the letter by lamplight, remembering the young man who had died holding his hand, and for the first time in 50 years, he understood something Dr. Collins had been trying to tell him. Johnson's death wasn't Thomas's failure, it was war's failure, the failure of a system that sent young men to die in places that didn't matter for reasons that made no sense. But Johnson's life, the 20 years he'd lived before that mortar round found him, that was real. The laughter Thomas remembered, the stories Johnson had told about his girlfriend back in Detroit, the way he'd looked out for the newer soldiers in their unit, that was what mattered. And Johnson had lived those 20 years because 53 other soldiers had made it home to live their own lives. Thomas picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never called. "Dr. Collins? This is Thomas Martinez. I know it's late, but I've been thinking about what you said. I'm listening. If Dr. Hendricks' offer is still open, I'd like to talk about it. Not because I think I can be the medic I used to be, but because maybe I can be something better, someone who uses what he learned in the worst place in the world to help people in a better place." Dr. Collins was quiet for a moment. "The offer is still open. But I need to ask you something honestly, are you ready to be responsible for patients again? Ready to make life and death decisions? Ready to risk failing someone?" Thomas looked at the letter to Johnson's mother, at the photographs of soldiers who had trusted him with their lives, at the combat medical badge that represented both his greatest triumphs and his deepest fears. "I've been carrying failure for 50 years, he said. "Maybe it's time to carry success instead." The next morning, Thomas walked into Dr. Hendricks' office wearing his best shirt and carrying a folder containing his military medical records, his Bronze Stars, and his combat medical badge. He sat across from her desk with the posture of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said. "And I'd like to accept it, with conditions." Dr. Hendricks leaned forward, interested. "What conditions?" "I want to work night shifts, where the trauma cases come in. I want to work with the residents and medical students, teaching them what textbooks can't teach about emergency medicine. And I want to establish a program for treating veterans who come into our emergency department with PTSD and service-connected injuries." "That's ambitious." "I've been hiding from medicine for 15 years, Thomas replied. "If I'm going to come back, I want to come back all the way." Dr. Hendricks smiled and extended her hand. "Welcome back to medicine, Dr. Martinez." "It's just Thomas," he said, shaking her hand. "The rank belongs to someone I used to be. This is someone new." Within a month, Thomas was working 3 nights a week in the emergency department, initially shadowing residents and gradually taking on more responsibility as he updated his skills and learned civilian protocols. His reputation spread quickly, the former combat medic who could stabilize the most critical patients with an efficiency that amazed even experienced emergency physicians. But more importantly, Thomas found purpose again. Every trauma patient became an opportunity to use skills that had been dormant for too long. Every life saved became a small redemption for the lives he hadn't been able to save in Vietnam. Every young doctor he taught became a way of multiplying his impact, ensuring that the lessons learned in Firebase Alpha would continue saving lives long after he was gone. The nightmares didn't stop entirely, but they changed. Instead of dreaming only about the soldiers he'd lost, Thomas began dreaming about the patients he'd saved, about Mr. Henderson going home to his family, about residents who would go on to save thousands of lives using techniques he'd taught them. For the first time in 50 years, Thomas Martinez was no longer hiding from who he was. He was finally ready to be the medic he'd always been, in a place where healing was possible and hope was stronger than fear. 6 months after returning to medicine, Thomas Martinez had transformed the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. What had once been a skeleton crew of exhausted residents and overworked nurses had become one of the most effective emergency departments in the state, largely due to the presence of a 68-year-old former combat medic who had finally found his way home. The changes were both subtle and profound. Thomas didn't just treat patients, he taught everyone around him how to see trauma differently, how to prioritize interventions, how to remain calm under pressure. Young residents who had been intimidated by emergency medicine found confidence working alongside someone who had learned trauma care in conditions they could barely imagine. Dr. Sarah Kim, a second-year resident, put it best: working with Thomas is like having 50 years of emergency medicine experience standing next to you. He doesn't just know what to do, he knows why it works, when it won't work, and what to do when nothing else works. But Thomas's most significant impact came through his work with veteran patients. Word had spread through the local veteran community that St. Mary's had a former combat medic on staff, someone who understood not just their medical needs but their reluctance to seek help, their distrust of civilian medical systems, and their tendency to minimize symptoms that might be life-threatening. Marcus Thompson, a Marine veteran from Iraq, had been living with chronic pain and untreated PTSD for 8 years when he finally came to St. Mary's Emergency Department. He'd been to other hospitals, but had always left without receiving treatment because the medical staff didn't understand military culture and he couldn't explain his symptoms in ways they could comprehend. Thomas took one look at Marcus and saw himself 40 years earlier, a young veteran carrying invisible wounds, too proud to ask for help and too damaged to accept it when offered. "Marines?" Thomas asked, noting the tattoo on Marcus's forearm. "Yes, sir. 2 tours in Fallujah. I was Army, Vietnam. Different war, same problems. Tell me what's really wrong." It took 3 hours, but Marcus finally opened up about the nightmares, the flashbacks, the way loud noises made him dive for cover, the guilt he felt about surviving when others hadn't. Thomas listened without judgment, understanding every word in ways that civilian doctors couldn't. More importantly, Thomas knew how to connect Marcus with the right resources, not just medical treatment, but veteran-specific counseling, support groups, and practical assistance with disability claims and employment services. "The war doesn't end when you come home," Thomas told Marcus during one of their sessions. "It just moves to a different battlefield. But you don't have to fight it alone." Marcus became the first success story in what would become the Thomas Martinez Veteran Support Program at St. Mary's. Within a year, the program was treating dozens of veterans who had previously avoided medical care, providing not just emergency services but comprehensive support for service-connected health issues and mental health challenges. The program attracted attention from the VA, from veteran service organizations, and from medical professionals across the country who wanted to replicate Thomas's model. But for Thomas, the recognition was less important than the individual lives being changed. Like Jennifer Santos, an Army veteran who had been self-medicating her PTSD with alcohol until Thomas helped her find proper treatment. Like David Park, a Navy veteran who had been ignoring chest pains that turned out to be early signs of a heart condition. Like Robert Williams, an Air Force veteran who had been living in his car rather than seek help for injuries sustained during deployment. Each veteran who found healing through the program was, in Thomas's mind, a small redemption for the soldiers he hadn't been able to save in Vietnam. Each life improved was proof that the skills he'd learned in that terrible place could be used for something good, something healing, something that honored both the living and the dead. Thomas also began speaking at medical schools, sharing his experiences with students who would never face the extreme conditions he'd worked under but who could learn from the principles that had guided him through the worst situations imaginable. "Medicine isn't just about knowing procedures," he would tell them. "It's about understanding that every patient is someone's son or daughter, someone's hope for the future. The technical skills you can learn from textbooks. The human skills, the ability to remain calm when everything is falling apart, to make decisions when there's no good option, to keep trying when failure seems certain, those you have to learn from experience." His story spread beyond the medical community. Local newspapers picked it up, then national veteran publications. Then major media outlets fascinated by the tale of a combat hero who had hidden in plain sight for 15 years before finding his way back to medicine. But Thomas deflected most interview requests and speaking invitations. He wasn't interested in being famous for his past, he was focused on the present, on the patients who needed his help and the young doctors who could learn from his experience. "Heroes don't hide," a reporter asked him during one of the few interviews he accepted. Why did you spend 15 years as an orderly when you could have been saving lives as a doctor? Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. Because sometimes healing yourself is the hardest part of healing others. I had to learn how to live with the weight of what I'd seen before I could risk carrying that weight again. The 15 years weren't wasted, they were necessary. They taught me that survival isn't enough. You have to find a way to turn survival into service. On the first anniversary of Mr. Henderson's cardiac arrest, the emergency that had changed everything, Thomas was working his usual night shift when Dr. Collins approached him in the break room. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a photo. It showed Mr. Henderson at his granddaughter's wedding, walking her down the aisle with a huge smile on his face. On the back, someone had written, "Thank you for giving me the chance to see this day. Harold Henderson." Thomas stared at the photo for a long moment, thinking about all the moments that existed because of split-second decisions made under pressure, about lives saved and futures preserved, about the ripple effects of choosing courage over comfort. "You know what the best part is?" Dr. Collins said. "Mr. Henderson has no idea he was saved by one of the most decorated combat medics in Vietnam history. To him, you're just Thomas, the guy who knew what to do when nobody else did." Thomas smiled, putting the photo in his pocket next to the combat medical badge he now carried openly. "That's exactly who I want to be." As his shift ended and he walked out into the morning sunlight, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him from a terrified 19-year-old in Vietnam to a 68-year-old man who had finally made peace with his past. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were balanced now by dreams of the future, by plans for expanding the veteran support program, by the satisfaction of knowing that his hardest experiences had become his greatest strengths.